She won?
Yeah. I just got really into it like 2 years ago. Me too. And I felt really bad because like it's everything that's wrong with like I couldn't help myself. So I was working, I was like just watching it, just like listen to the case and it's so evil because they have this scrolling commentary. People are just like, man, this is brutal.
Hey, Armel, I'm gonna have you turn your microphone on if you get the little silver button. And also, you can talk about whatever you want because I don't care, but you are going to be live on the internet shortly. So, people can hear your mic now. Okay, wait, let's see. Dee, dee, dee. Bam. Good to go. Let me make sure that's working. Sorry, doing double duty today.
Can you hear me? Or?
Yes, we're good. Yeah, we're good.
I mean, stand up right in front. It's fine. What could go hitting?
Yeah. I need to stretch my legs.
Once off?
All right, hello, welcome, welcome. Hello, everybody. Oh, you're too kind. For those of you in the back, don't freak out. I'm gonna like blather on for a minute while you finish getting your beverages. We'll try to give you lots of time. For those of you tuning in online, hello. Nice to have all of you here. Is this anybody's first time here? Welcome, welcome, welcome friends. Well, this is a very nice group of people, so you should also be nice. And we have a lot of friendly faces in here tonight as well, so thank you as always for coming to our events, coming back, having a good time. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Patty. I'm the founder and executive director of Chicago for Chicagoans. We've been, thank you. Yeah. We have been around for almost 7 years. Our 7-year birthday will be this June. I started this organization because I felt Chicagoans needed a place where they could learn about Chicago history next to their neighbors, and nobody had to pay a very exorbitant fee to get in the door. At the time, I was a broke person, and tours are really expensive and really out of reach for me. So our organization, since the very beginning, has always conducted programming on a pay-what-you-can basis, which means if you're struggling a little bit right now, no problem. Welcome in. We're happy to see you. And if you're feeling a little flush, we take donations. We accept cash, check, credit card, Venmo, kidneys, anything we can sell in the black market, we will accept as a donation. But we also accept time. We love volunteers. Big shout out to our volunteers tonight, Olivia and Stephanie. These ladies show up every single week and answer the door and bombard you with information about our organization and welcome you in. And we literally could not do it without them. Olivia recently joined our volunteer staff as our marketing maven, so you've seen her up here introducing our speakers this series, which has been really fun. Lightens my workload a little bit, which is great because I have a lot of paperwork to do. Yeah, thank you so much. So this whole lecture series, we're almost to the end of it. This is our second to last event. We have one more lecture this season. Next week, we're going to have Anthony up here talking about lost Chicago neighborhoods. But before we get there, this week, we're going to talk about one very specific neighborhood, and that is Pullman. But even more specifically, the sort of ignored North Pullman area. And some of the South as well. Pullman in general. But Pullman's a really broad neighborhood. It's a very exciting neighborhood. It's going through a lot of transformation at this period of time. President Obama, you may remember, designated it a national monument. So there's been a lot of activity happening in Pullman. So if you've been in Chicago for the last 5-6 years and you've ever been down there, lots of things are happening. So it's quite the hot topic right now. And to speak about it, I'm very excited to introduce this evening's speaker, Armel Sagbohan. He is an architect. He also is a lecturer at IIT. I had the pleasure of speaking to some of his young architecture students this semester, so now he owes me a favor and he's here. He was a little intimidated by this event, so if you're not nice to him, meet me outside. I'm going to beat you up. But in all seriousness, thanks for being here. We're really excited to have him speak about Pullman and some of the work he's been doing down there. So I think seeing the bar line whittle its way down, I'm going to go ahead and say we're ready to get started. So give them a nice warm welcome, guys.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, sorry, but I was going to talk about the lost buildings of North Pullman, but turns out I'm still working through some of that information research, and really there's a lot of buildings in Pullman that have been lost over the years, so talking about the buildings of North Pullman is kind of a subset of the topic, and the broader topic of just the buildings of Pullman that have been lost. So I'll talk about the North Pullman buildings a little bit towards the end, so I'm not going to totally exclude it, but generally speaking, I'm going to talk about Pullman overall. Just some background on myself, and well, actually, first of all, who here has been to Pullman? Okay, awesome. Has anybody been there before 2015? No? Yeah. Okay. The reason I say that, and you know, I'll kind of come to it, but it's just completely transformed over the last few years, quite incredibly. And actually, my first introduction to Pullman was when I was a student at the College of Architecture at IIT. And at the time, I was taking a drawing class because I was kind of lazy. I was like, oh, I'm going to take a drawing class and get this A, hopefully, which I did. But on this particular field trip, we had to go to different places around Chicago to draw different buildings. And so one of the places we went to was Pullman. And at the time, I knew nothing about Pullman. But while I was there, it felt weighty, it felt significant, and so while I was there, I drew the Greenstone Church, which is a building I'll talk about a little bit. Beautiful church. And then I left the town, and I didn't really think much about it because I was busy with school and what have you. And then by chance, later on, once I came back to Chicago to practice as an architect, I had some of my first projects in the Pullman neighborhood. And so as a result, I became very familiar with Pullman, making repeated trips for different projects. And so I got to see its transformation, and I somewhat got into photographing the town. It became kind of an obsession at some point, where every time I make a trip, I would take a photograph of something different. And so some of these images in the packet, some of the first photos are just a series of photos I've been taking over the last probably 5 years at this point. And it was kind of my way of thinking through the landscape, trying to understand the way of the land, the patterns, and yeah, so now it's like a collection of, I don't know, maybe 1,000 photos or so. And through that process, I became familiar with the buildings pretty intimately, and the back alleys and all the different types of details. So, you know, at one scale, if you go to Pullman, you'll notice the buildings at a certain scale if you're just kind of looking at the overall composition. But there's also an incredible amount of detail in the facades, which you can see on some of these other images, all the way down to handrails, down to doorknobs, to hinges on doors. So if you ever make a trip there, I would say with any given building, spend the time to not just look at the building, but to walk around and really take a look at all of those details. One building in particular, the church that's down there, if you go into the church, you know, when you open the door, take a look at the door handle. When the door's open, you can look at the hinges and you can see this incredible level of detail just to everything. So, so that's what those photos are in the beginning are about. There's also a couple photos of the two factory buildings that remain there, but those are only two buildings of what was once a very large complex. And so that's what I'm going to kind of cover today, is talking about all the buildings that have kind of been lost over the years. Something I should mention also too is that there's small page numbers at the bottom. And so let's say page number 3, on the Google Drive, there'll be a series of photos that start with the number 3, which corresponds to basically the page number. At any point, feel free to interrupt me or ask for clarification. So as I mentioned, yeah, so I was pretty familiar with Pullman. And what I noticed too over the years as I've been going through the landscape is that, particularly in North Pullman, if you go to northern Pullman, it's actually I call it North Pullman, so the northern portion of Pullman, you will see that there's a series of vacant lots. And so there's a lot of townhomes which are basically side by side by side, but every once in a while you'll see a building that's missing. And so something that stood out to me was the question as to what were those buildings on those different lots and what were the circumstances that led to them not being there. And that kind of led towards me looking towards the past to understand, like, how did it get to what it is today from what it was when it started. And so on page 6 is a lithograph of what the town was like in its inception. And that drawing was done before the town was ever constructed. And that drawing is available online. It's in the Google Drive, and it has an incredible amount of detail. You can really zoom in and see a lot of detail. So yeah, that's kind of what the town was when it started. But before I go into the architecture, into the town, I'm going to talk about how it got to be, why it started. And it basically starts with George Pullman. George Pullman was the founder of the town. He was born in New York, 1831. And his father was a carpenter and also had a business moving buildings, picking up buildings and moving them, basically. And that's significant because at the time, the Erie Canal was being widened. And so he went to work for his father. And so he became familiar with basically this business of picking up buildings and moving them. And his father apparently invented some kind of jack that could lift buildings. And this was important because in the mid-1800s, Chicago was basically in the process of lifting its buildings. Chicago being a very flat land, there was this issue of sewer. And since the water table was so high, you couldn't really dig down. And so the solution essentially was to raise the buildings to put the sewer lines in. And so since Pullman was familiar with this, he had come to Chicago. And he had a business of raising buildings. And so some of the images on page 8 are the Madison House. That's a building that his company raised. Along with other companies, they pulled together, they raised other buildings in the town. So around the time, too, he also went out to Colorado, made some money in mining. And then around the same time, he was doing a lot of trips around the nation. And the story goes that on a trip somewhere in New York, he was thinking about rail travel. And rail travel was becoming quite expansive in the United States at the time. And at the time, it was not particularly comfortable. And so he thought that there was a better way to do it. And so he started with 2 rail cars, where he outfitted 2 rail cars to make it more comfortable, more cushy chairs, more cushy surroundings. And these were quite the hit. And they're quite elaborate. And so, for example, page 9 shows the interior of one of those train cars. I don't know if that was the first one. And around the same time, what's another critical event at the same time is the fact that Lincoln was assassinated. And so there was the cortege that was taking him from D.C. to Springfield. And so George Pullman, being the shrewd business person he lent the carriage to the Lincoln family. And so as it traveled across the nation, people got to see it. It was great advertising, and then kind of helped him expand his business, essentially. I'm trying to think what else about the setup. Let's see. Yeah, so I mean, essentially, his business expands. It grows and grows and grows. Initially, he didn't have a factory. Initially, he was contracting and these things out to other folks or other railroad lines. But as his business continued to grow, eventually he saw the need to have a factory, and so he purchased a factory from another company in Detroit. And that was his first major operation, where he built these rail cars. At the time, too, a couple other critical events in the story also is the fact that there's a Chicago fire that meant that Chicago had to be rebuilt, which was important because he saw this opportunity to come to Chicago to help and to expand out his business. And then also at the same time, there was a railroad strike in the late 1800s. And the railroad strike was associated with the fact that there was a kind of depression. Workers were being laid off, wages were being reduced. And workers were upset about that, and so essentially there was riots in Baltimore that spread across the nation, and this is important because he was involved with rail, and this influenced his thinking as he was moving forward about making his company town, is that he wanted to make sure that he could make a town and have workers that were content. And so this railroad strike was really critical to his thinking in terms of like how can he expand his company, but at the same time have workers that are content. So, yeah. So anyway, he's looking to move out of Detroit because his business is expanding. Chicago at the time was just bustling. It was quite central to the rail industry. A lot of railroads came into Chicago, went outward. And so when he's looking to build this new factory to expand his operations, he's not necessarily going to be in Chicago. He kind of sees Chicago as like this place that's crowded. He had just seen the whole thing with the sewers. The potential of workers who are in Chicago could be tempted by bars and other vices. So when he's looking to expand his factory out, he ends up settling upon the area in Lake Calumet. This is about like modern day, 103rd Street, 115, roughly speaking. And since he knew that if his name was associated with any land purchases in the area, there'd be this, land prices go up. And so he hires somebody to basically purchase the land for him. And so from many different landowners in the area, he purchases about 4,000 acres of land, which would basically become the future home of this company town. Being close to Lake Calumet too is also important in the sense that it provided shipping opportunities, but that area too also had the rails going by. So it's really an opportune spot for him to basically create this feature town. I'm on page 12, essentially. Page 13 is basically one of the earlier drawings or map of Pullman. This is not the one that was built, but this roughly shows how it's going to be laid out. Those docks that are showed that are tying into Lake Calumet were never actually built. What I find surprising is that Lake Calumet came up to the shores. Initially, when I'd read about it and seen that image, I didn't believe it, and I had to see it several times to realize that Lake Calumet came right up to the shore of Pullman. So anyway, to build this town, he hires an architect, Beeman. He also hires a landscape architect and a sanitary engineer. And this is important because, back then, I'm not sure how teams were assembled for projects, but today, like if you built a project, you'd assemble a whole team. But this was quite forward thinking at the time, is that he didn't think to himself like, okay, I'm going to just hire this architect to do the buildings. But he understood that landscape was an important portion of it, but then also the things underneath the landscape, such as the water pipes and the sewer pipes. And of course, having that experience of lifting buildings in downtown Chicago and seeing how sanitary conditions could make people sick, he understood that this was an important thing to solve ahead of time. And so I think the sanitary engineer was actually the first person he hired, not the architect. And so he hires him, and they lay out the town. They actually end up raising the town, just like they did in downtown Chicago. And they installed quite an extensive sewer system, such that the sewer and the water systems collection systems were essentially separate. And then the architect, Beeman, he was very young at the time when he was hired, 27. And I think, the landscape architect, Barrett, had actually done work for Pullman. So he had introduced him to Beeman, and he hired Beeman for the project. Why he hired him exactly, I'm not entirely sure. I think he had done some work at his house, and he liked the work. And so he was like, okay, I guess you're designing this huge factory. And back then, I don't know if he needed any particular expertise to design a factory. I think he just had to know how to do long-span structures. I guess he was capable, and so he hires him. I've heard one story out there too, where at one point he wanted to meet with Beeman, like in 1879 or so, and said, "Hey, I want to talk to you about the project." And then Beeman thought he just wanted to talk about the project and just have some ideas, but apparently he wanted to see some plans. So apparently the night before he was frantically working to say, "Okay, here's what it is." So I think the pace was incredible from the start. That he gets hired in 1879, and I think construction starts, in 1880. And the grounds are huge. So page 15 shows kind of the extent of the town. On the far left, which is north, so It's more like this. So Chicago's up here by my hand. This is the rail station today. But if you're looking at the map, generally speaking, the blue portion is a residential zone that's in the north. The pink is the factory grounds. The yellow is the residential portion that's to the south of the factory. And there's a couple other portions that I'll talk about. On page 15, that's where you can see the construction of the town happening. And so I just can't even imagine that in a year or so they were designing all these buildings and then had them under construction. Some other stories out there is that one of his draftsperson would mention in some anecdotal story how the pace was so frantic that sometimes he would be at the site just drawing things on the ground, saying, okay, this is kind of how you're doing it. And that they were short-staffed, such that he mentioned that one of the draftspersons was mentioning how he was designing trusses. And so there's some commentary out there about how some of the truss design on some of the buildings is kind of a little weird, but it works, and it stood the test of time. So I don't know how many people worked in the offices, but I'd be really curious to know how they did it. So there's a lot of good archives out there of these drawings that we'll talk about a little bit later on. Page 15, that's another construction photo. That's a photo of them digging a trench for, or a pit, or the foundations for a future water tower. So that's from like 1881. Just to show how quickly the town grew, he was hired 1879, roughly speaking. I think construction started 1880, and then the first resident moved in on January 1st, 1881. And so by March of that year, it was 57 folks. By 1883, it was 4,500. And then by 1890, it was 10,000 residents. And then it peaked at 1892 with 14,000, roughly speaking. So the isometric drawing, that's kind of what the town looked like originally. And it had everything that was needed to construct these rail cars. And so it had administrative buildings, it had buildings for fabricating the cars, for painting them. It had lumber yards that were used to frame out the vehicles. It had a building where they made wheels. Yeah, I mean, basically the town was basically to be self-sufficient in its operations, and I think it only relied upon outside vendors simply for raw materials, but they made everything in the factories. So I'm just going to take you through some of the buildings. So page 17, that is the administrative building that you see dead center. That was the main building in the town in terms of the factories. That's where the offices were, engineering department. That would be the main building you would see as you arrived in the town, because back then how folks arrived at the town was via the rail system. And so as you come down the rails, you would see that clock, and so you can see the clock actually faces the rail line versus facing the town. And in that picture right there, you can see there's a lake in front. That was about a 3-acre lake, artificial lake. They had dredged it up, and they'd used some of that soil to basically raise the buildings in the area. And you can see how incredible the landscape is there, and how the building just reflects off that lake is quite incredible. Flanking the building on the left and the right side, those were the front erecting shops, and that's where they fabricated the train bodies. And then on the right, or not my right, but on the next image is the erecting shops, and that's, as I mentioned, that's where they fabricated the buildings. And so, or sorry, the buildings, the train cars. And then in between, on that photo on page 18, there's a transfer pit, and so the fabricate a portion of the car inside one of those buildings. They would take them out of these large doors, put them in this portion called the transfer pit, and then they would scoot them along into other portions of the buildings to complete the rest of the operation. And so that little vehicle you see there is called a donkey engine, which is what I found out, because I guess it was an engine that did the task of what horses would do back in the days. Page 19, or image 19, that's a picture in front of the re-erecting shop. Well, there was the front erecting shops which were closer to the closer to the train line, and there's the re-erecting shops were in the back. And there you can see a bunch of the gentlemen who worked on those. But it's crazy because even in that photo, the doors on there are quite elaborate, and in fact, those doors still exist on the building that's still there. And in fact, if you go to one of the first images I've taken, I think early in the presentation, you'll actually see those doors, I think on page 3. So yeah, it'd be nice if they can preserve those as they go forward. Page 19, that's the transfer pit between the two. That's still the transfer pit that you see there. And in fact, you can see some bridges, and so there was a series of bridges that were also designed such that factory workers that were on the top floors didn't have to go down and then across the transfer pit, but could just go across. Page 20, that's just an image of one of the factories. I don't know which building that exactly is, but that's just to show how expansive it was. There's plenty of photos out there of just all sorts of activities that happened in those buildings. To power the grounds, there was something. I'm going through some other buildings on the campus grounds, but there was an engine building that had a Corliss engine in it. The Corliss engine was a steam engine that was displayed in some exhibition in Philadelphia, and then afterwards, George Pullman purchased it. They disassembled it, put it on 13 cars, brought it to the factory grounds, assembled it, and then that was used to basically power all the machines. And in the construction photo, I mean, that thing is massive, but in the construction photo, you can see that they are constructing the Corliss engine as they're constructing the building around it. So kind of an incredible feat. Next to that building was the water tower. And so the foundations that we saw in the other building, the water tower essentially was that. It had a 500,000 gallon tank at the very top. Very tall building. I think at the time it was the third tallest building in the United States. And I think the other ones were somewhere in New York. It was at 195 feet tall. So at the very, very top was the water tank. At the very bottom was the sewage. So for the sewage, basically it'd be fed into this building, and then from that building it would be piped out to the southern portion of Pullman, where they had farms, and it was used as fertilizer in the farms. And so it was kind of an interesting process. Yeah, quite ahead of its time. And so the floors in between, those were used for different departments. Electrical department, glass department, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so 23, slide 23, or the images associated with 23, these are some other buildings on the grounds. So there's one called the gas building. That's where they made gas.
Really?
Yeah, I guess there's a process called a Lowe's process, which I don't know anything about, but apparently there's some way to make gas, liquid gas from coal or what have you. But they would have make this gas here. They had it in huge buildings, and that remained as such until at some point the town was actually connected to the gas utilities, and so that building was no longer useful, and they turned it into basically a brass shop. But I mean, even for that building, it's quite elaborate, quite pretty. There was another building called the Allen, I forgot what the exact name is, but the Allen Paper Wheel Works, which was another thing that I was like, what, paper wheels? I thought like maybe it's the name of the person, but literally paper wheels. They had this process where they would laminate these different sheets of paper, and then they would compress it between two metal hubs. And so they used to use these paper wheels on the earlier trains because they didn't transmit as much of the vibrations from the tracks, so it gave it a smoother ride. But I think they were not as safe, and at some point I think they were essentially banned, which basically led to that company being shut down. But they used to make those wheels in that shop essentially. If you look at a map of Pullman of that time, you'll also see small, like not small, but buildings for laundry. Essentially, I mean, I kind of totally glossed over this, but you know, these sleeping cars and these parlor cars, there was all sorts of cars that Pullman made, and essentially they had a monopoly on it. And so they called it hotels on wheels because they had just so many passengers that were sleeping on these things, which means they had to have a bunch of linens and towels. So the company had like, I don't know, like 4 million towels or something and linens. And so they had like 10 laundries around the country that they would wash these things at. And so at that ground, they had like this laundry room. And that's typically where like a lot of the women would work, in these laundry rooms essentially. So that's kind of the factory grounds. And as I mentioned, the factory grounds were basically for making train cars essentially. They made passenger cars, parlor cars, box cars, you name it. But also what the town had was a lot of cultural buildings and residential buildings. And I think that's really what made this town unique, was that while the factory grounds were, you know, for the industry, Pullman also had this idea of making these residents and then also these other cultural amenities. So as I mentioned with the railroad strike, he understood or thought to himself like, well, I got to make these other amenities, make this beautiful town such that the workers will be content, will not want to strike, will be productive. So there's a series of buildings in the town that were for these other aspects of life. So I'm going to talk about some of those buildings. The cultural buildings were basically south of the factory. Today, what's basically 111th Street. At the time, it was called Florence Boulevard, and Florence was his daughter, which was the portrait that you saw earlier in the presentation. So on slide 25, that was basically like the center of the town, where you had a hotel, you had an arcade building, parks, a school, a market hall, all sorts of buildings. And so the first building I'm going to talk about is the Hotel Florence. If you go to Pullman today, you will see it. It's still there. It's in several movies with the guy from James Bond, Daniel Craig. Yeah. What's the movie called? Road to Perdition, I think. Yeah, so you'll see the Hotel Florence in that movie. I forgot to mention too that clock tower, the main building, you'll see that in the Polar Express if you watch that movie, or a variation of it. Very, very similar. But the Hotel Florence, it was a hotel. It had 50 rooms. It had the bar, had the only bar that was in town, but it was not necessarily a bar where the workers would go. I mean, it was basically for the wealthy or the managers or people from out of town. It was the only place in town you could get a drink, essentially. So if you wanted a drink, you had to go to outside of Pullman. George Pullman did have a room that he kept there on the second floor. The second floor had the nicer rooms. The third floor had the not so nice rooms. And so when George Pullman would come to his factories, he'd basically stay in room 1 on the second floor. But he actually lived on Prairie Avenue, where he had like a mansion, which has its own crazy story too. It was a gorgeous building, his house downtown. But apparently in his will, I think he wanted it taken apart, and it was taken apart. Yeah. So the hotel's still there. You can go see it. It's had several owners over the years, and now I think they're in the process of trying to renovate it. So the hotel, actually, I should probably mention this right now, is that initially the town, everything was owned by the company. That the hotel was owned by the company, all the housing was owned by the company, all the factory grounds were owned by the company, and the workers there didn't own their houses. They had to rent from the company. And so at some point, there was a downturn in economic conditions, and so the story goes is that he had reduced the wages of the workers, but he did not reduce the rent, which the company owned all the houses. Yeah. And so there was basically a boycott, a strike, and so this strike was quite significant in the history of America, in the sense that it basically led to what we have, which is Labor Day. So yeah, there's a huge boycott of Pullman trains or train cars, what have you. So any railroad line that was carrying a Pullman car was basically boycotted, which meant that commerce basically came to a standstill in the United States. And so to break the strike, what happened was they ended up attaching United States mail cars to these things, which basically made it federal jurisdiction, and that broke the strike. So kind of, I guess, clever on the part of the government. But anyway, there was an investigation to this. They basically, Justice Department wanted to see what the deal was, and so when they investigated this, they just basically concluded that, you know, the conditions in Pullman of them owning everything led to this discontent. And so they forced the company essentially at that point to divest from any holdings it had that were not associated with the factory itself. So they start to sell off the hotel, the housing, all the non-factory buildings essentially. So the hotel got sold off and then had different buyers over time. I think 4 or 5 different people owned the hotel over the course of its history. And at one point, somebody who owned the hotel wanted to start selling off the furniture and all the different things in it, which was brought to the attention of folks in the community. And so they organized and halted it and purchased the hotel, and now has, I think, a different owner, which I think is the state. So, yeah. So page 27, that's another photo of the hotel there. Another incredible building was called the Arcade Building. This is page 28, a huge building, 250 feet by about 160 feet or so, 90 feet tall. And so this building was way bigger than the Hotel Florence. So if you ever go down to Pullman and see Hotel Florence, you can imagine a building next to it that was just crazy huge. 3-story building. It had a bunch of tea and coffee shop. I found one. I saw a photo of that and I zoomed in. I said, oh, tea and coffee shop. So that's probably where I'd hang out there. It had, I think, a doctor. It had a bank. Had a library. Had a theater that could seat 1,000 people. So whenever they had plays, they would entertain them in that building there. But as I mentioned, since the town had to divest from its non-factory buildings, once they did that, they sold that building. I think someone in the Pullman family ended up purchasing that building, but then 1920s or so, due to disinvestment, the building fell into bad conditions, and they basically just tore it down. So no longer exists. But on page 29, you can see some image of what the library looked like. And then on the next image, you can see that central arcade where light would come into the space. Page 30 is a great photo where you're looking south, and you can see the arcade building almost dead center in front of the lake, and then next to it you can see the hotels. So that kind of gives you a scale comparison there. And I don't know who those two people in front are. That lake, it existed until the early 90s, but then at some point they were looking to widen Cottage Grove, so they filled the lake in, and it basically was like a maintenance thing too. Is that once the town no longer had these investments in the cultural buildings and the housing, I think they basically simplified the landscape, because initially they were paying for all the landscaping. They had like a whole nursery of trees that they would use to basically populate the streets, populate the front yards, the gardens, you name it. But this tradition of gardening still exists there, that if you go to Pullman today, you'll see a lot of beautiful gardens in the front and the backyards. And so I think it's just really, it's really nice that, like I said, like the architecture is what's noticed and it's what you'll see today, but at the time, and even today, but at the time when he hired this landscape architect, they really take into consideration just the whole image of the town. Another building, this is the building, the Greenstone Church. That's the building that I mentioned that was the first time I'd gone to Pullman. That was my first interaction with the architecture there. The Greenstone Church is one of the few non-brick buildings in Pullman. All the buildings are made of brick, and you can imagine, with the Chicago fire, he was very much aware of the situation there. So they use brick for all the buildings there, but the Greenstone Church is the only one that's not, that I know that's not a red brick, and it's called greenstone because if you see it, the stone's kind of green. It's kind of a Pennsylvania serpentine stone, I think is what it's called, which has this kind of vein-like thing to it. I think it was the only church in town. I think it was expected. He thought that everyone would get together and worship together, but it was not the case. You had to rent the church, and the rent was not very low. And I think folks had different, wanted to practice in the way they wanted to practice, where they wanted to practice. So in other buildings in town, in the casino building, which I'll talk about ever so briefly, in the market hall, perhaps in their houses, they would worship independently. But the church is still there. You can go visit it. They are renovating it, and the organ that's in there is still original. And so on a certain day, the pastor there will play. If you go and you can hear it. Stained glass windows. Yeah, quite a nice church. Page 33. That is the athletic island, and so that was another benefit of being next to Lake Calumet, is that he was also able to leverage the water for sports and recreation, aquatic things. The island had two stands. It's basically an artificial island. It had these two stands, this grandstand that faced the field, and in the field they would have foot races, bicycle races. Sports was a big thing in Pullman. And again, there's this idea of people being young and healthy and being able to work. And so sports was encouraged, and they had all sorts of sports team. They had rowing, they had cricket. I discovered the other day they had soccer. What else? Baseball. Yeah, lots of different sports teams. So yeah, that's where they'd host different sporting events. And then there was also this other stand here on the right of the image where you could watch the rowing races. And then on the digital version, if you zoom in, you could probably see the water tower way back in the distance. Yeah. Page 34 or image 34, you can see the rowing team there on the right. And in addition to these sports teams, they also had a band in the town, and apparently the band was quite well known. They would travel the United States for promotion, what have you. And apparently, I guess on the day of the strike, I guess to make things seem normal, they had the band play in the town center. So, like the Titanic, essentially. Yeah. And then dead center in that image is the gentleman who actually conducted the band. And then one of the town managers, H.H. Sessions, he's on the far left with the cane and the top hat. And apparently, I think the band used to practice in the water tower in one of those floors. They use that for practice from time to time. Yeah, everybody has a mustache except I think for three people or so. I think in that image. Yeah. Perhaps the building with the most tragic story is the Market Hall. If you go there today, you will see what remains of the Market Hall. But what you're seeing, if you go to Pullman today, in terms of the Market Hall, is actually the second version of the Market Hall. There was actually an original version of the Market Hall that was built with the original town, but then it succumbed to fire. There was a lot of goods and fats and oils, and so there was a fire, and the fire was just feeding off of all these oils, and so the fire department couldn't do anything, and so that building burnt down. That's image number 35. But when it burnt down, it was at the time of when before the World's Fair was coming to Chicago, and so there's going to be a lot of visitors to Chicago, and so Pullman didn't want to have people come and see these ashes, and so in quick haste, a new Market Hall was basically designed, and then it was just built within a short time period. And at the same time, they basically built these things called these colonnade apartments that you'll go see. You'll see them around the Market Hall. And apparently the style matched what was being put into the World's Fair. So that Market Hall existed for quite a while until the 30s, 1930s, where it, I think another fire happened. And so at the time, it was the Depression in the United States, and so they didn't have the money to basically build it. And so they left it basically as a one-story building, which is what you see today, except caught fire again in 1974. And so what you'll see today now is just the shell of the building. And yeah. But in that building, they had stalls. The food that was grown, I think, from the farms that were south, where the sewage fed into, those were sold in the area. And I guess to keep things clean, he didn't want people selling, vegetables and meats in the town. So that's like the only place you could actually go and purchase and sell those things. Another building that still exists is called the Stables. This is image 37. And that's where I I say park your horse, but my wife says you don't park a horse, you stable a horse, I guess. So, but if you had a horse, that's where you'd park it. And the fire department operated out of there, out of that space. And then at one point, that building became a gas station. And then now I think a nonprofit exists out of it. But a really beautiful building, and if you go there today, you'll still see a couple horses' heads on the side of the building. And then I don't know, there's a black and white image I think in one of the slides that shows a drawing of one of those little towers there, and that's just one of many drawings that exist out there. And so I find those drawings fascinating and a lot of fun to look at, just the amount of detail that went into these buildings. Page 38 or image 38, that's a photo from it's on there, 1885. And that is a view of the town from the west. So in that image, you're probably standing almost on Michigan Avenue, roughly speaking, maybe a little bit in front of Michigan Avenue, but you're looking east towards the town. And so there you get the whole snapshot of the town. Well, the middle portion, where on the far left you can see the water tower, and you can see the smokestack next to it. The triangular building, that's the administrative building, and then on the far right is the arcade building, and then just to the right of the street you can see the hotel. So. 38, 39. 39 is looking down Cottage Grove or looking up towards Cottage Grove. So on the far left, you can see the arcade building, then next to it, the stables. And then the two buildings closest to us are essentially the casino building. That's where the town undertaker was and the photographer for the, yeah.
Casino, undertaker, and photographer?
No, the casino building, so I don't think the casino building has anything to do with like casino and gambling. I don't think that would be allowed in the town. So it's called the casino building. I don't know where the term comes from. But in that building too, they would some of the religious folks would also practice in that building too. The school closest to us, they had to build a school once the town started to expand. They could no longer hold classes in the market hall or any of these other buildings, so they had to build a purpose-built school. And that school was basically torn down, I think, in the early 90s, 1902, 1903 or something like that, once they built a bigger school. That still exists. The bigger school still exists there. So yeah, that's kind of the gist of what the cultural buildings were. You know, it was like a school, the casino building, the stables, the market hall, Hotel Florence, the athletic fields. So yeah, the arcade building basically disappeared because of disinvestment. They had to tear it down. I think once the company stopped being invested in the non-industrial buildings, the grandstand and the athletic field basically fell apart too. That was probably like a wood structure. The market hall fire consumed it, but still hanging on. The school, they built a different school, so they torn down the old school. And the casino building, I'm not sure what happened to that or what led to that one being taken down. In terms of residents, as I mentioned, you know, the residential areas were also built at the same time as the factory to house the workers. The residential area also took on this kind of hierarchical approach where the nicer residents, the larger ones, were closer to the factory. The residents in the northern portion of Pullman were less desirable. They were just far away from the factory, so those ones ended up getting subdivided, they were lesser quality. But the ones in the south are pretty well preserved, they're still there. So on 111th Street, which is right adjacent to the factory grounds on Florence Boulevard, that's where you have the bigger houses. So when you come into Pullman, if you were to go there today, that's what you basically see once you come to the town. And so you know, the town manager, the superintendents, the foremans, they would live on that street. The town doctor lived on that street too because it was closest to the factory in case injuries. And the band conductor lived on that street, which makes me wonder, like, why was he so prominent, or like how much money did that guy have? But anyway, he lived on 111th Street essentially. So yeah, so images 40 and 41, those just show the residential area in the southern portion of Pullman. And on 41, it's just interesting to see how you can see on the left where there's no trees, and then on the right image you can see when all the trees are already filled in. So yeah, I'm not going to talk much about the buildings in the southern portion. There's house tours they can go on in September. If you go down to Pullman in September, you'll get access to some house tours there. You can walk the town today. You see all those buildings. Yeah, they're quite intricate, and there's a whole bunch of different types, which is really nice. I think the architect did an amazing job because, he didn't have this monotonous, homogeneous streetscape. He was able to vary the roof lines, vary the brick detailing, the ins and outs, such that it really feels like, there's all these different housing types. So yeah, if you have a chance, just go check it out. And yeah, also with the houses too, in terms of design, as I mentioned, like each one has a little garden space in front, and in the back of this garden, they were very well lit. They had indoor plumbing at the time, which was quite rare, especially for that quality of house. And they also had gas, so the houses were quite advanced, and they're stood the test of time. They're still in use today. So, but there's another whole housing section to the north of Pullman. So on the map, it's basically the blue, and so this is between like 103rd Street today and 108. And then basically from 108 to like 111 is a factory, and then from 111 down to 115 is the southern portion of Pullman. But I see conflicting reports out there in terms of when the northern portion was built. One story I've heard is that the northern portion was built initially, but it was so far from the factory grounds, so people didn't want to walk, so they started building the southern portion and they just kind of let the northern portion be. I've heard that they were built at the same time. So I'm not entirely sure as to when it was built, but the housing was in fact substandard to the southern portion, that if you go there today, you can kind of see there's not as much intricacy to them. And that the northern portion, since they were less desirable, I think they were shared with another company. They were subdivided in different ways. Yeah, so the northern portion, it's in different condition than the southern portion. And I'm not entirely, well, I have my theories, but some other things to mention about Pullman is that, going back to the story of the company itself, it expanded and expanded, of course, as companies do. It essentially had a monopoly on the train industry. One thing to note too, and this is more about the story of the company itself versus the architecture, but they didn't only, one thing they did that was quite clever on their part is that they made these train cars, and instead of selling them, they basically leased them to the railroad lines, because what they knew was that to build, especially like with these cars, how intricate they were, incredible woodworking and steel, stained glass, and all these other textiles in the cars. They were very expensive to make, but the money was not in making them. It was basically in leasing them to the railroad lines and then running them. And they provided the staff. I don't know if you folks have heard about the Pullman porters, but these were the freed slaves that George Pullman essentially hired to be Pullman porters, which were very critical to the growing middle class for the African Americans at the time, and the civil rights movement, which is another topic. Definitely worth exploring. Definitely worth learning about if you don't know about it. But what was I going to say? Yeah, so they leased these train cars. They ran them. So not only did they build them, they also operated them. And so they ate up the competitors, and eventually they were running like basically all the train cars in the United States. And so during World War II, around 1940s, 1950s, there was an antitrust lawsuit against the company, basically telling them, hey, you got to sell off one of these divisions. And so they did that, and then they had these other issues where airline travel was starting to become more prevalent, the interstate highway was starting to become more prevalent, and so the interest and the demand for railroad travel started to decline, which basically led to the company basically meeting its ends essentially. So there was flight from Pullman, is my understanding. It became kind of blighted. And then there was basically a proposal by the Chamber of Commerce, I think the Roseland Chamber of Commerce, to basically demolish all the residential section from like 111 down to 115. And so that's when folks in the area started to organize, start to seek out city landmark status, state landmark status, and that really preserved that portion. But somehow I think the northern portion was not incorporated initially. It got incorporated a little bit later on. And so there's just kind of this sense of, I don't know, there's just a little bit of a different quality of housing in the northern and the southern portion too. So if you go there today, you'll kind of see that disparity. And so what I've been particularly interested in is documenting a lot of the buildings in the northern portion. And so let's see if I have some images here maybe. Here we go. Give me a second while I find what number I ended up on.
Looks like 46.
46? Yeah, 46, why not? Okay. Yeah, so I mean, if you go to Northern Pullman today, there's a lot of houses, a lot of different blocks, but only I'd say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like five or so blocks are actually the historical homes. And as I mentioned, like you'll see some house and you'll see like a missing portion of it or an empty lot. And so, for example, on page 46, you'll see there's a series of photos that show. Actually, no. Let me go back. Actually. There we go. Sorry. Let me go back a little bit. 43. Yeah. 43 is, that's a historical photo of 104th Street. And so in looking through the archives for historical photos of North Pullman, I've only ever come across 4 photos, I think. So if you have other ones out there, let me know. But page 43 essentially shows the houses that were on the northern portion. Those are the northernmost houses, and those were actually demolished to make way for a school. On 43, another 43, I don't know why I have 2 43s, there's another series of houses that are kind of offset from one another, which I think is quite interesting because typically you'll see flat facades where all the houses are aligned, but since there's this diagonal of Cottage Grove, today Cottage Grove, rather than aligning the face of the house to the street, he's basically offset those houses. So that's like a rarity. We won't see offset houses like that. In that photo there, you can actually see an arch in the center of those houses there. And the other day I was at the Newberry Library and I saw a photo from some gentleman who took these photos in the 1970s, and one of them was captioned, "The last arch in Pullman." And so I guess, and there was a photograph of that space today, and I was like, the last arch, like what are these arches? And then I read another account where I guess between buildings, there's these arches, at least in southern Pullman, where I guess they were decorative, but then as vehicles got bigger and like garbage trucks needed to come by, they had to demolish these arches in the alleyways. And so if you walk in the southern portion of Pullman, in some alleyways, you'll see like part of the arch on one side and part of the arch on the other side. So yeah.
Well, when we visited there a few years ago, and I thought that was like horse stables in the past. I could be wrong. Like there's a sort of a round building. It's still a structure, you know, but it's not really a building anymore. And then there are these arches. You kind of, you know, take pictures. Oh, there's an arch. I think the guide said that they used to be horse stables.
And that's the market.
That's the market hall, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, those arches, like, so yeah, if you look at the market hall is like these 3 arches on the facade on each end, and then the building that go around are the colonnade building, those arches, and those were built, I think, for, I don't know if it was for guests or what, during the World's Fair, but they had like 2 apartments on one floor, and then another apartment on the top floor, and yeah. So 44 is another picture of the buildings on North Pullman. That's south. Oh, they say Erickson Avenue. I think they might have changed the name. I'm not entirely sure, but I mean, also it's another thing too. Like the names in Pullman have changed over time. That initially there were names of inventors, people in the town, you name it, and then now they've changed over to different names. But that's another 104. Yeah. Okay, so that's another section of Northern Pullman. I think that what we're staring at on 43 is actually corresponding to the map on 45. Oh yeah, it is. Oh, I do know what I'm talking about. Okay, great. Yeah, so on the map on 45, you see 104th Street and Erickson. So this picture on 44 is 104th Street and Erickson, yeah. So on that map on 45, all the pink buildings still exist, but the ones that are hatched out, those are gone, essentially. So basically on the Erickson side, you can see there's basically lost like 1, 2, 3, basically 5 buildings. And so what's really sad, I think about it like species, like, oh, you've lost the last species and you can't recover it, is that on the two ends you can see both buildings are hatched out, which means they're both gone. And so a lot of things were symmetrical on the blocks. If you know one building on the left side, you can find another on the right side. But in that case, the one on the left side is gone and the one on the right side is gone. So there's no really, you have to find out what's there. Luckily for us, on Google Earth or Google Street View, page 46, if you see on that slide where the building's gone, you can see in 2007 it still existed. So basically what I've gone to Street View, I've kind of gone back as far as I can, which is basically up to 2007. And so 2007, it's still there. 2011, it's still there. And then somewhere between 2011 and 2012, it's gone. So based on seeing that building, I'm able to tell what the building on the other side is, essentially. So now I'm kind of engaged in this process of trying to figure out every single building in North Pullman and trying to make sure I map each one out before they disappear. And unfortunately, a lot of them are, I won't say in a state of disrepair, you can always repair them, but they're missing their roofs, they're missing bricks, they're missing this and that. And so I don't know who owns these buildings, but it's one of those things that like every time I go back to Pullman, I kind of check on it and say, oh, is it still there? And so yeah. Page 47, what you can see is photos of buildings in North Pullman or missing buildings. And so in one of those photos, you can see there's half a building and it's missing its partner. And these other ones you can see where there's these gaps essentially in the landscape. You can see ones where they're boarded up. You can see ones that have the city sticker with a big red X, which means don't go into it, and basically it's going to fall apart. And that's the deal. So yeah, pretty sad. There's one photo there too that really has been bothering me. It's the one with the small house in the front, the one-story house in the foreground. And that one's been bothering me for a long time because obviously that building doesn't belong there. But that block is not very symmetrical. So if you look at page 48, that's a map of that area. So the lower left-hand corner building, which is right next to the roundabout, is that building. But there's no replica of that building anywhere else on the map, so I can say, okay, that building used to be this on that lot. So it's been bothering me for the longest time until yesterday when I was putting this presentation together. On page 49, I was looking at this Allen Paper Wheel Works, and I was like, hey, I've never seen that building before in the background. So on the left side of the picture on 49 is what I believe to be that building. And it corresponds with having the balcony facing to the south. So I think that is the only image I know and have to try and recreate that building. So that's where I'm going to end it. Well, actually, I got one more slide. Yeah, okay. The last slide, just to go out of architecture or what have you, is it's another one of those stories where I saw it, I was like, what, that doesn't make sense, or is that true or not? Is this Snow Cruiser? Page 50 or slide 50. And so this thing was built in 1930-something, 1937. I don't know exactly, but I think it rolled out of the factories at 111th Street, rolled out at 1938. And so there was this gentleman, I don't know his name, but he was basically doing these expeditions in Antarctica. And so this thing was designed and built, also designed in Pullman, but it was designed and then it was fabricated in Pullman to aid in this expedition. But thing's huge, as you can see. It's about 55 feet long. It's like 20 feet wide, roughly speaking, 16 feet tall. And you can see that gentleman there next to a tire. So after they fabricate it, it's too big to sit on any other vehicle to move it to the port to get it to Antarctica. So They drive it there, exactly, yeah. They end up driving it there, but it's a behemoth of a vehicle, and so it only goes 20, 25 miles per hour. And so they slowly drive this thing there. And as you can see in this image, people came out to see this thing driving down the street. I imagine like people might watch the space shuttle going, driving through. It clips a bunch of trees. I think it damages a bridge somewhere. It gets stuck in some ditch. But eventually it makes it to the port. But it doesn't fit on the ship, apparently. And so to make it fit, they chop off a piece of it and put the backside piece on the ship along with the rest of it. And they get it there, and apparently I guess they weld it on. I don't know how that works exactly. But they roll this thing off the ship and just into the snow. It's so huge. And so apparently this thing was very useless in that regard. Very sad, yeah.
Why would they build it?
Yeah, well, I guess they didn't take in all those considerations. And so,
So it didn't make it to Antarctica?
no, it made it there. It made it there, but it couldn't really like move around or what have you. And this is 1989, I don't know, 1940. No, yeah.
Apparently they don't have snow tires, it just has like really smooth swamp tires.
That's what it looks like in the image.
So it just
Yeah.
it didn't go anywhere.
So is it just sitting there in Antarctica still?
Well, what happened is we're talking about World War happens, priorities shift, folks head over to war. And of course, World War II basically advanced technology such that when they came back to find it, the technology at that point was so far advanced that whatever was in it was not really usable. So my understanding is that they used it as some kind of base or something. I guess maybe it's well insulated, I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, it's somewhere there or somewhere underneath it. I have no idea. But, so yeah, I mean, it's just interesting to think that they made that thing. During World War II, they made ships and other things associated with the war at the factories. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the broad overview of Pullman and its architecture. Yeah, I guess some other things too to mention. Yeah, sorry. Some other things to mention too is that for example, the water tower they're going to sell some land in Pullman in the 1950s. They were demolishing or burning down some other portion or some stack. That fire spread to the water tower. The water tower got damaged. They had to tear that building down. As I mentioned, the school, once it was obsolete, they tore that down. The arcade building, we talked about that one. But a lot of the other parts of the factories existed up all the way till the 1990s or so. And then there was a fire that was set by someone. I don't know if it was arsonist or he was trying to stay warm. The story's out there somewhere. But consumed a large part of the factory. And so people were advocating just tearing down whatever remained. Luckily, some folks had some foresight and some vision to say, okay, let's preserve what remains. And so now that's where the National Park Services has their headquarters. They rebuilt the clock tower. The front erecting shop still exists. One of the rear erecting shops still exists in a shell. But the rest of the buildings basically are gone. Yeah.
Questions? Okay,
On the back. Oh no, ladies first.
What would you call the architectural style of Pullman?
Queen Anne style, I think is what it's called. These pointy roofs, shingles, wood shingles. I think Queen Anne style is typically built out of wood, but it's all brick there. I'd say the Market Hall has a different style, but I think that corresponds to the fact that it was built at a slightly different time and was kind of fitting in with what the styles were at the World's Fair. There is a building called the Greystone House that is on the corner in front of the church, which is definitely not that style. That was a separate house that was built the house on the lot. I don't know what happened to it, but they built this other building called the Greystone Church. So if you go there, you'll see this building and be like, hey, this doesn't fit in with what's there, I guess. But yeah, Queen Anne style, I think, is what it's referred to. Yeah.
Dumb question. Really dumb question. Can you relate anything about the Ferris wheel and the Pullman cars?
No. Is there a reason that, have you heard something about it, or?
Yeah, I thought that the original Ferris wheel.
Oh,
The original Ferris wheel was built with train cars, but I don't know if they were Pullman cars.
I
interesting.
thought they were Pullman cars. I could be wrong about that. That's why I'm asking.
You know, I have not come across that piece of information. I'm going to say no because I think I probably have come across it at this point, but it's something that I'm going to look into.
I think you're probably right.
Yeah, no, but it's something, yeah.
I've got another dumb question.
Great.
Can I ask another dumb question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Where was Pullman buried?
He's buried, Graceland. Yeah.
Under a lot of stone.
Yeah, under a lot of stone, yeah, because of the Pullman strike. You know, he was not a popular man. And so, you know, they were concerned about grave robbers, whatever it is. And so, yeah, he's down there. And I guess they really reinforced it. There's a column on top that's actually designed by the architect of the town, Beeman. He designed the same column. He's buried there with some family members. Yeah.
I have a question.
Second question better than the first, right?
Oh, yeah.
So my question is, as an architect today, what do you think is most interesting about the architecture in Pullman? Like you mentioned, how impressive it is and how quickly it was built, which is how I feel about the 1893 Rose Fair, too.
Yeah.
But, like, is there anything else about some of the architecture in Pullman that you're like, what the heck?
I think the issue for me is that I'm comparing it to modern standards, that like getting a building done today is just like impossible in any reasonable time. And so the fact that they were able to do all these drawings so quickly and construct so rapidly, to me is just an incredible feat. But I think what to me is really impressive is just how holistic the planning was. That the sanitary angle was taken care of initially, the landscaping, which a lot of it's changed and it's a bit lost, so we don't get to really appreciate it. But the front yards that are there, the backyards. So I guess what's amazing to me is that the test of time, that neighborhood today is incredible, and has been around for, you know, how long has it been around for? So I just think that the architect and the team was just very astute to details, that there's just details in everything. And at a time where, you know, there's questions over ornamentation in architecture, what have you, I think, however somebody feels about it, I think it's just amazing the detail that went to the buildings. So, yeah.
We also have an internet question. So for the houses of Pullman, when George Pullman allowed his workers to live outside of Pullman in places like Kensington or Roseland, where residents could freely drink and not live under his rules, were there any benefits for an employee to live within Pullman city limits? Were their jobs more secure? Did they make more salary? Or were they just closer to work?
Yeah, so my understanding is that some other places outside of Pullman started to spring up because there was folks who didn't want to be under the strict guidelines, whether it was drinking or not being able to own the property, or, for example, you know, there were informatives that were, you know, amongst the workers, you know, and so these other neighborhoods sprung up, and folks wanted to, you know, have more freedom. But in terms of the benefit to living in Pullman, my understanding is that, yeah, your job was more secure, and you had preferential treatment essentially in some capacity. So that was the benefit of, yeah.
Any other questions?
Were the houses that the Pullman porters lived in the same as the workers who work in the factories?
So the Pullman porters did not live in Pullman. So essentially, I don't think any African Americans, in fact, lived within the boundaries of the town. I think there was a census, and there was like maybe 4, and I don't know if there were workers in the hotels, essentially. And in the census, there's like a few from Asia. So yeah, the Pullman porters did not live in town. And the Pullman porters, really, the story with the Pullman porters is it's tied to the town in some capacity, but that's the things that happened with the Pullman porters tended to happen in other places. And essentially the story with the Pullman porters is once George Pullman basically hired, he was the largest employer of African Americans, and since he knew that they knew how to cater to white folks, essentially, they were basically working on the trains, carrying luggage, turning down the beds, just at the beckoning call of the employees. And a lot of them were called George, and so but they got to travel the United States. They got to pick up culture here and there and everywhere, and so that also apparently helped fuel the middle class for the community, because they were able to better educate their kids, and they basically unionized. They used to work horrendous conditions, sleeping I think a few hours a night, and I think actually when they ended up unionizing, there was A. Philip Randolph who was he was I think in Brooklyn maybe or in New York. He was not a Pullman porter, because if he was, he'd basically be fired. So he helps lead this organization, and they become the first African American union basically to negotiate with a major U.S. corporation. And I think the negotiation was like, okay, we're gonna get 4 hours of sleep now at night. It was just like, I was like, what was it before then?
Oh no.
So absolutely crazy. But yeah, I mean, just an incredible set of gentlemen. And a lot of the folks who had experiences in that went on to contribute to the civil rights movement. And I think people say A. Philip Randolph was the grandfather of the civil rights movement. And as I mentioned, a lot of people who were Pullman porters, they went on to push the movement forward, essentially. But yeah, they did not live in Pullman.
Any other questions?
I have one. Were there any other contemporary to Pullman or maybe even modern day examples of planned towns around any other industries?
Yeah, that's one thing that I'm not very familiar with, but yes, there was. So I don't think it was, I don't know if it was the first company town in the United States or the third, but there were others, and there was others abroad in England, and probably, I think also in Germany. I think this one potentially was modeled after one in Germany. I'm not entirely sure, but to answer your question directly, yeah, there was. With this one, though, I think the significance with this one is just the total, I'm going to say, and this is in my own words, but the total engineering that went into it, not just like at a technical level, but at the fact that you had these athletic fields to promote healthy living for the workers, and the idea that we're going to have this church for people to worship in, and we're going to control the rent. That to me, it was this thing that really felt like social engineering, that seemed to take it to almost like another level. And I think the fact that he was being responsive, I think, to the railroad strike and his other experiences. So I think his experience with that basically, I think, fueled potentially, and again, these are my own words, this desire to control things, essentially. And I think just in the fact that how detailed and meticulous the town was, and how detailed and meticulous the trains were, this whole thing I think was really, really thought of. So I think that's what makes this one particularly unique and interesting. In the fact too that it just spawned on all these other aspects of civil and labor rights. Yep, there you go. Cool.
I told you we were nice.
You are.
Well, this is just a humble ploy to implore you. If you had a good time and you're impressed with all of these amazing images, like me personally, I love Pullman. I've been down there many times. I have never seen all of these photos before. So I was really geeking out in the corner. Hopefully you were too. But yeah, this took a lot of time to put together. So again, we implore you to make a donation if you can. But also to come back next week. And in 2 weeks from now, we're going to have a little party. So make sure you RSVP for that too. Thanks, guys.
Yay.